I'm Gwyn Edwards. I'm the Director of the Common Core Curriculum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth lecture in the Common Core Distinguished Lecture Series. We'll begin the evening by inviting Dr. Peter Chung, who's the coordinator of the China Culture, State and Society, AOI, to introduce our evening speaker. Peter.
Thank you, Green. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Let me first welcome you to this event. I'm Peter Chung from the Department of Politics and Public Admin, and I'm also the convener of the China Area of Inquiry. I'm most honored to introduce Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom, who will deliver the first distinguished lecture for the China Area of Inquiry for the Common Core Curriculum today. Professor Wasserstrom is Chancellor's Professor and Chair of the Department of History at the University of California, Irvine. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and he has formerly taught at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is currently the editor of the Journal of Asian Studies, the flagship journal of the Association for Asian Studies in the United States. Jeff is a preeminent expert on modern Chinese history with a wide range of research interests. He has written 4 books and edited several more. He is probably best known for his works on student protests in Shanghai, but he has also written on the Chinese Revolution, on gender, and the impact of globalization on popular culture and urban affairs in China as well. His most recent book is an edited volume entitled Chinese Characters, Profiles of Fast-Changing Lives in a Fast-Changing Land, published by the University of California Press last year. Through writing on the lives of a diverse group of Chinese people, I think Jeff and his other colleagues are trying to provide different lenses with which we can use to understand the profound change that are unfolding in China today. Unlike most academic historians, Jeff is also a public intellectual. He has done a lot to engage the general audience through various means. For instance, in 2010, he has published a short book written in the form of question and answers, China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. This unusual book poses highly challenging questions about China's past, present, and future, and provides concise but also very incisive and insightful answers for the general reader. Now let me just quote some of my favorite entries here. So who was Confucius? And why is Confucius back in favor? Were all dynasties the same? How powerful is Chinese nationalism? What kind of government will China have in a decade? So I would highly recommend Jeff's book to all of you if you do not have them already. Further, Jeff has worked as a consultant to the filmmakers of the Longbow Group, which produce widely known and highly acclaimed documentaries, such as The Gate of Heavenly Peace, about the Tiananmen incident in 1989, and The Morning Sun, a documentary on the Cultural Revolution. During the last decade, he has written a lot of commentaries and reviews for magazines such as Time, Newsweek, and Foreign Policy, or newspapers such as the LA Times and the New York Times online editions. He is also a blogger. He contributes regularly to the Huffington Post. It is indeed a most timely moment for us to listen to his views on the challenges facing China in the 21st century. Not only China, but also the rest of Asia and Hong Kong have witnessed profound changes in the past year. And this week marks the beginning of a new term of the National People's Congress under the new leadership of General Secretary Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping aspires to bring about China's national rejuvenation, as you all know. Okay. Jeff just came back from Shanghai after speaking at the Shanghai International Literary Festival. So without further ado, let's turn the floor to Jeff, and he will deliver the first distinguished lecture for the China AOI. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I love the city of Hong Kong, even if I write a lot about Shanghai. And I've found it fascinating through the last 25 years or so to periodically go from Shanghai to Hong Kong or from Hong Kong to the mainland and note things that are similar or different between the two places. And even though I prepared this talk before I came here, I like to always begin with something taken from the experience getting someplace. When I was entering into the Hong Kong airport, there were announcements about the penalties for anybody who took more than 2 cans, I think it is, of powdered milk powder to the mainland. And that made me think about one of the differences between several times that I've gone between the mainland and Hong Kong. When I lived in Shanghai for the 1986-1987 academic year, my wife and I came to Hong Kong midway through that for Chinese New Year. And we spent a month here, which was a wonderful month of rest and relaxation. And this may be hard for those of you who are of the younger generation to realize, but in 1986, Shanghai was the most boring city on earth. It was the least fun city I'd ever lived in my life. It was an interesting city. It was a fascinating city. And in fact, I think in some ways, it was a better city than it is now even. But it was a very boring city. There was no entertainment. There was nothing to do at night. There was nothing to do on the weekend. There were 4 private restaurants. Now there are 50,000, just to give you a sense of degrees of change. So when we got back from this enjoyable sojourn in Hong Kong, there was a certain amount of fascination with our Shanghainese friends. What was it like there? What were the department stores like? There was an envy of Hong Kong as a place where you could buy all sorts of things that you couldn't buy in Shanghai. When I told Shanghai friends in the mid-1990s that I was going to go to Hong Kong after being in Shanghai, they just kind of shrugged. So what? You know, by that point, you had the department stores that could buy just about all the things you could in Hong Kong. There was no envy of the creature comforts, material, the kind of decadence of Hong Kong had been admired or lusted after something in the 1980s, and by the mid-1990s, that wasn't there. There was some interest, though, in the books that you could buy in Hong Kong that you couldn't buy in Shanghai. So that was what was envied. So you went from a time of envying the department stores to envying the bookstores, to now, to the extent there's something's envied, it's the food and drink that you can count on not being tainted. I think that says a lot, less about Hong Kong than it does about the mainland and how things have changed there. And I'll get to some of that in this talk as well. I just began. This was I want to thank my hosts for inviting me here. It's great to be invited back here and to inaugurate the lectures that go along with this new core course on China. And I want to thank Peter as well for that lovely introduction. And shamelessly promote the book that he mentioned to you as one of the ones this is the question and answer based book, China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. But if you don't get around to buying this one in the next couple of months, I'd like you to buy my next book, which may look fairly similar, and it has the same title, but it's the updated edition, which I did with help this time from Mara Cunningham, a graduate student in history and somebody who's making a name for herself as a writer, and someone who, until recently, until we closed the blog, was the editor of the China Beat blog, which a group of us had running from 2008 to 2012, that tried to connect what academics were writing about China with what general people were interested in about China and what journalists were writing about China. In any case, and so this is the book that I want you to buy if you don't get around to the other one. The cover of the book, I always like to begin talking about They say, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but this one, it's all right to judge it by, because the cover actually says a lot about what's inside. The cover of the book is, I began to go to China, as I said, in the mid-1980s. And a lot of what I've written for a general public or the sort of short pieces I've done since then, when I'm not focusing on the sort of larger historical projects, are ways of me working through figuring out how it is that China has changed and hasn't changed since the mid-1980s. And the cover of this book kind of sums up the dilemma for me and for a lot of us who study China, which is that when I went to China in 1986, you saw scenes like this, which was a bunch of men who ran the country, dressed alike, voted alike. Anything had a unanimous decision when it came before China's leaders. And that was how a Communist Party-run authoritarian state tended to operate. This didn't look that different from the Soviet Union when it was under Communist Party rule. The leadership would dress alike and vote alike and all that. The thing was, when I was in China in '86, while this was the scene, there was nothing like this. That's a scene taken at a punk rock concert in the early 21st century. So the dilemma in making sense of the riddle about China is, how do you have a situation where you still have this, but you now have this? You now have things going on in Chinese youth culture that are completely in step with global youth culture. And yet, you have a political structure that's still, in many ways, locked into the situation that it had before. And you simply didn't have this in the communist world during the Cold War. When I was growing up, the presumption was that in Communist Party-run states, popular culture was very different from what it was in other parts of the world, as well as the political structure being distinctive. As I began to give talks about this, this book and this cover, though, I began to notice things that are actually connected between the top and the bottom. That this represents a sort of stuck-in-the-pastness, this represents a new kind of China, but in fact there are things that connect the top and the bottom picture. And I'd like to begin talks about it by asking people in the audience what they think is similar about the top and the bottom. Anybody? This is your chance to show off for your teachers how well you've been studying, how bright you are, how quick. Anybody notice anything that's similar about the top and bottom pictures? Don't be shy. Even the teachers can answer. Yeah? The fact that there is Mao up here, as well as there, very good point. And Che Guevara also was associated with communist movement too. Excellent answer. Anything else that connects this picture with this picture? All men. Good answer. You got an A. All right. There is like one woman in the background here, and if you look very carefully, you might see one there. But this is an important thing, because in fact, while I said this is about China being stuck into an earlier period, in fact, one of the things has been a retreat from gender equality by the Chinese Communist Party, even though throughout its rule, the people holding the most power have tended to be men. There used to be under Mao a lot of discussion, at least, of the value of raising the status of women. And one of the first things that Mao and company did was introduce a new marriage law that gave women's equality in marriage and divorce. Anything else that connects the top and bottom picture? They're all Chinese. That I don't know. That's a B- answer, but it's true. You're right. You're right. And I guess it's not surprising that this would all be Chinese. Usually the people running a country are all for the people of that. But one thing left out is that one thing that has changed is that there are more and more foreigners in China. So there could be something there. One thing that you may not even notice, because it's such an ordinary thing in Chinese culture, but it's something that I like to point out when I give a talk like this in the West, is the importance not only of Mao showing up here, but the color red showing up here and showing up here. And in fact, what that I think suggests is, among other things, it's that communism's global color is the color red. But this was the biggest lucky development for the Chinese Communist Party, that when it came along, the global color for communism was red, which also happened to be in Chinese culture a color for happiness, fecundity, wealth. And in fact, if you look at it, while you can say there's a bit of revolutionariness covering it here, these images here, although it's at a Communist Party event, those look a lot like a New Year's couplets that would be in traditional popular culture too. Okay, there's one final thing that the top and bottom pictures have in common that nobody's answered, but I think it's the cleverest one. And I didn't come up with it, but a colleague of mine at Irvine who grew up in China did. And he said the really noticeable thing about all of these guys and these guys is they all dye their hair. So to make this topical, because Xi Jinping is in the process of being enshrined in Beijing in power, and a lot of people are arguing about, is Xi Jinping going to be a very different kind of ruler? Is he going to be the same kind of powerful figure? And I'll talk a little bit about what I think is a problem with how that question's framed sometimes. But I do want to show you one thing that hints at perhaps him being different. This looks the same kind of image. I didn't have to update this part about the book, going from first edition to second edition. I could leave the cover as it is because it's still a bunch of look-alike men. But this, a daring sign, there are some streaks of gray in there. So if you're looking for hints that Xi Jinping is going to be different, look at that here. We'll see if his hair keeps showing the gray or if it disappears. And we'll see more profoundly if the differences with Xi Jinping are just at the very subtle symbolic levels, like he's talking much more about rooting out corruption. Will he really do it? Or will it just be like letting a few hairs go gray? All right. I don't have that much time. I've already wasted some of it. So I won't be able to tell you everything you need to know about China in the 21st century. For that, you'll have to buy the book. But I will tell you 5 things I think you need to know about China. And I'll get to each of these. So I won't use many words on the screen. I think that's boring. I like to use images. But I will come back to these 5 things. And then I will talk about 5 things that I think are worth knowing about how China is covered in the media. And this was based on a talk that I wrote to deliver this part of it, to deliver to an American audience. And I'm really talking about how the American media covers China versus other things. And I thought about changing it, but I thought actually it was useful to leave it as it is, because one of the things that I, as an American coming here to talk to you, can help inform you about is how China is thought about in America. So that, and we can think together about ways in which the story would be different if we talked about how the Hong Kong media versus the mainland media dealt with things. There'd be some overlap and some differences. But I'll put all these words up later, but I just sort of give them so you have something to think about as we go through. All right, the first thing I think that everybody needs to know about China, it's maybe particularly important for people living in the West, maybe particularly important for people of an older generation than many of you who grew up during the Cold War. And what's important is that China is not just a 1984 state, but in some ways also a Brave New World state. 1984, how many of you have read 1984? Or at least know something about it? Like you've heard of Big Brother, a Big Brother state. Brave New World, how many of you have read Brave New World? All right, that's a little bit less known. It's dropping out of the curriculum, but it was often things you would, throughout the 20th century, these were the 2 most important dystopian novels. And in many other future versions of dystopia, there are variations on 1984 or Brave New World or blendings of them. How many of you have seen The Matrix? The Matrix is a part Brave New World and part 1984. Brave New World is when you don't know that there's anything other than the surface, the shiny surface that you see. 1984 is the actual hard repression that you see when you've taken either the blue or the red pill, whatever it is you do. So anyway, 1984 was written by George Orwell. It was about a big brother state in which the government keeps control by striking fear into the populace. You step out of line and you get clamped down on. It's a complete censorship state. Orwell described the method of rule as the boot on the face over and over again. It's thought of a version of hard authoritarianism. During the Cold War in the West, this was seen as the ultimate novel describing Communist Party-run societies. Orwell was a critic of many things, not just communism, but also imperialism, colonialism, and he saw some things about 1984 as in part a critique of colonialism, but it was really understood throughout most of the Cold War as describing Communist Party-run states. Brave New World, on the other hand, was by Aldous Huxley, and it described something we might think of as a soft authoritarianism, where the authorities rule not through fear, but by manipulating the desires and pleasures of the population. In Brave New World, people don't rebel not because they're afraid necessarily, but because they're blissed out. The government gives them this drug called soma that makes them ridiculously happy. They get to watch a lot of porn. It's just a place in which bread and circuses or just people are kept distracted, and it's a hedonistic version. And it's often seen as a critique of capitalism. So in the 20th century, these were the two great examples of dystopianism. It seemed to be quite clear that if you were criticizing the capitalist West, you might talk about Brave New World elements. If you were talking about Communist Party-run states, you would talk about 1984. China no longer fits easily into the 1984 sign, though there are some elements within it that are 1984-like. There are also Brave New World kind of elements. This is a shot of Shanghai. And it depends in part on which part of the People's Republic of China you're talking about, whether it's more 1984 or Brave New World. In Tibet and Xinjiang, the structures of rule are more like 1984. In Hong Kong, part of the People's Republic of China, it's much less 1984 and much more Brave New World. In places like Beijing and Shanghai, it's a mix of both, and it's more about periods of time being 1984-like moments and Brave New World-type periods. So, as I said, one is soft authoritarianism, the other is hard authoritarianism. The poster child for a Brave New World kind of authoritarianism now might be Singapore. The poster child for 1984 would be North Korea. China is not quite like either. There are still moments when there are boot on the face kinds of structures in 1984, and China becomes more like 1984 again at any moment that's seen as a time of emergency or a special moment when extra vigilance is needed. So it's kind of a geographical thing that moves, but it's also a temporal one. And in more kind of relaxed times, it shifts back toward people, keeping people happy through satisfying their desires than through their fears. And so material goods and things like this. And I think one of the things that we could say happened was during the crackdown of 1989, it was a last gasp of a certain kind of pure Orwellianness. Orwell's 1984 is also associated with the idea that the government can tell you lies and you are forced to believe them. In Orwell's 1984, the government tells one of the characters, admit that 2 + 2 = 5 if we say it does. And that's the kind of ultimate description of it. In Brave New World, it's that people are kept so busily distracted that they don't really care about challenging the government's view of the truth. You still have some elements of both, but it moves between them. The second thing I think everybody needs to know about China is to be wary of either-or choices. And I've already given you an example of being wary of an either-or choice. It isn't that China is either like 1984 or Brave New World, but that there are mixes of the two in that, as well in other parts of the world. Now, this is something that I grew up associating with China, but you would not necessarily have, which was that in America, and I knew very little about China as a child, but one thing I knew was that when you ordered at a Chinese restaurant, you ordered differently than at most Western ones. In Western ones, you had to sort of choose a main dish that would either be chicken or beef. If you were on an airplane, they would come by and say, do you want the chicken or beef? If you were at the school cafeteria, chicken or beef. But in Chinese restaurants, it was pick one from column A and one from column B. You put together a meal by mixing different elements and have more than one thing to eat. But in discussions of China in the American media, and to some extent in media everywhere, there's a tendency to want to make you choose from one side of the menu or the other. Is China, what is the big China story? Is the big China story the persistence of the Communist Party rule, or is the big China story the economic boom? Well, it's actually both of the stories, and many others as well. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of why I think discussions of China go astray if you look for an either-or answer. Will Xi Jinping be a reformer or a conservative? This is the way things have been posed about him, including by somebody who's quite a prominent voice when it comes to American discussion of China, because he was the New York Times China correspondent. He won a Pulitzer, along with others, for covering 1989. And he says, here's my prediction about China. The new paramount leader, Xi Jinping, will spearhead a resurgence of reform and probably some political easing as well. He says Mao's body will be hauled out of Tiananmen Square. Liu Xiaobo will be released from prison. But my hunch, he's saying he's not absolutely sure he's right, but my hunch is it's changing. Now, I mean, I don't want to pick on Nicholas Kristof too much, even though I have in a piece I co-wrote about this. But he also said somewhat similar things when Hu Jintao came into power. He saw hints that Hu Jintao would be a reformer as well. But the point isn't that I'm going to say, no, he's wrong. Xi Jinping will be a conservative. It's that I think the question is misframed. What will be very likely is that Xi Jinping will order from both the conservative and the reformer side of the menu. And he'll put together a set of dishes that are some about change and some about continuity. Just like this guy. This is a photo taken in Hong Kong, as you may recognize, the Hong Kong Museum of History, that shows the famous moment when Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher worked out the details about 1997. But Deng Xiaoping, his name is associated with reform. The reform period began when Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao. Hua Guofeng was in the middle, but we won't go into that. But Deng Xiaoping is associated with reform. But he also was a conservative in some times. He reformed the economy, but in 1989, while backing the massacre of June 4th that crushed the student movement and student-led mass movement that also involved many workers and other urbanites, he showed that in some ways, when it came to certain political decisions, he was a conservative. So we should expect to find a mixture of reform and conservative choices. Another way in which people, I think, sometimes mistakenly want to go for an either-or chicken or beef kind of decision, when in fact you could say it's mixing and matching from different sides of the menu, is when it comes to artistic and creative figures. So does everybody know who this is? Ai Weiwei. Okay, and this? Zhang Yimou. All right. Ai Weiwei now, so let's again, with the menu, just to drive this metaphor into the ground. Let's imagine that when creative figures, they have a choice between oppositional forms of expression and conformist forms of expression. Ai Weiwei now chooses intentionally only from the critical side of the menu. Zhang Yimou, who started out being kind of an edgy independent filmmaker, increasingly now chooses from the conformist side, being a state choreographer for events like the Olympics. Now, both of them went through a period when they weren't that, where they were doing more of a mix and match thing. Ai Weiwei, before he completely went into a kind of oppositional mode, was part of the team that was designing the Bird's Nest Stadium, which was going to be an Olympic venue and all that. But they've moved to represent these two different poles. So when Mo Yan won the Nobel Prize for Literature, what I think people made a mistake sometimes in commentary saying is, well, which is he? Is he like Ai Weiwei? Are his novels surprisingly subversive? Or is he more like Zhang Yimou? After all, he's in the Official Writers Association. He's a vice chairman of the Official Writers Association. And then they sort of were parsing how would he react once he got the Nobel Prize. And he made one statement about how he hopes that Liu Xiaobo soon will be free. People say, oh, okay, he's showing his true colors now, and he's actually an oppositional figure. He's just been holding it in. But then he went to receive the Nobel Prize and was asked about censorship or said something. And he says, well, it's just kind of an inconvenience, like going through airport security. He said, oh, well, he's showing his true colors. But in fact, it's not a matter of being one or the other. It's about mixing and matching, choosing between the two sides of the menu, as do most of the creative figures in China these days. Very few of them are completely in one or the other category. So when we want to try to talk about them, and we can think about their art or their political choices, we think about how they combine things. And in this case, I think Mo Yan does move between the two. Some of his novels have a subversive side to them, but he tends to go after relatively safe figures. He lambasts official corruption, but tends to just focus on local officials, which the government is perfectly ready to say local officials can be very corrupt. He doesn't take on the most daring kinds of things. He moves between the two registers. He's not just saying official propaganda, the way that when Zhang Yimou choreographs a celebration of the 60th anniversary of the founding of the PRC is, but he makes relatively safe choices when he makes that comment about censorship. There are other people who are neither quite like Ai Weiwei or quite like Zhang Yimou who make, I think, more daring choices. Yanlian Ke, for example, who I don't have a picture of, he wanted to be able to publish. He got one of his novels, some of his novels have been banned in China. He wanted to be able to write a novel that could be published in China again. So he wrote one in which he engaged in some kind of self-censorship in order to make sure it would be able to be published. So that was kind of choosing from the conformist side of the menu. But after it came out, he went public about the fact that he'd pulled his punches in that novel, and he felt like he'd been forced to castrate himself. To say that artists under censorship engage in self-castration is very different from saying it's just like going through airport security. This is Yu Hua, who I think makes some of the most interesting choices. You know, unlike Ai Weiwei, who's completely oppositional, Yu Hua is still a member of the Official Writers Association. And he still writes novels that can be published in China. But he also publishes things outside of China that can only be published outside of China, that, including the essays that went into China in 10 Words, which if you're going to buy one book after hearing this talk, don't buy mine, buy that one. I think it's great. And Yu Hua in that analyzes a group of words that he thinks help give you a sense of China today. And it's all things that couldn't be published in China, the mainland itself, but it then circulates back into the mainland in digital form, and he's quite happy about that. He's described sometimes the difference between his novels that take on relatively safe subjects and are critical in ways that are, you know, you really, only in kind of abstract symbolic ways are they critical, versus when he writes something that can only be published abroad that goes straight forward. He's described in a very good essay as saying, you know, you can't say the word Liu Si in China. You can't publish anything with Liu Si 6-4 for June 4th, the day of the massacre in 1989 that the Chinese government insists you not talk about. So what some bloggers did at one point when they wanted to commemorate 1989, but they couldn't say anything about it, and they didn't want it to be censored, they said they wanted to commemorate what had happened on May 35th. So what Yu Hua has now said is when he writes his novels, he goes around things, and if he wants to make a criticism, he does it in a roundabout way. That's doing a May 35th. But occasionally he just wants to come right out and say what he feels, and that he wants to do a June 4th. And when he does that, he publishes abroad, or he publishes in English, things like that. He just had a great op-ed, which I just can't resist mentioning to you, which he talked about how in China, in mainland China, there are many different kinds of censorship. There's a kind of censorship about things you write, and that's not as strict as the censorship about films you make. The film censors are the pickiest people. You have to be really careful with a film. And the film censors are looking for anything in that film that could be bad for people. They're trying to protect the people's health. So they're going through it with a fine-tooth comb every film. So what he thinks is they should take all the film censors and put them in charge of food safety, because that's where we need the people who are really picky. Anyway, so that's why I like his stuff so much. Han Han is another person who doesn't fit into, he's not an Ai Weiwei kind of figure, and he's not a Zhang Yimou kind of figure, so he confuses Western audiences completely. When I tell people this is one of the most interesting intellectual figures in China, people keep not being able to find a place for him. He's what? He's a popular novelist who's also an edgy blogger whose stuff gets taken down. Oh yeah, and he races cars and advertises products. He just doesn't fit in these categories. So I could talk about Han Han all day, but I'll move on. He's just had his first book published in English, so I'm wondering if that will make it easier to talk about him in future. Number 3 thing, which I've already in some ways hinted at, another thing to know about China, I think, for audiences, is that there's no single PRC internet story. That the story about the internet in China, when it's talked about in the West, is often told about as a story of censorship. And I've even fallen into that. When I've mentioned the internet, I've talked about censorship and getting around it. But in fact, as I think you all know, what most people in China do most of the time when they go on the internet has nothing to do with censorship, has nothing to do with politics, because most people using the internet in China, like most people using the internet everywhere around the world, are using it to do things like figure out where to eat that night, figure out how to get from point A to point B, maybe figure out who to date, maybe just kill time by entertaining themselves. The other thing is that the story of the internet in America is often told as a story as though American influences on the internet were all that really mattered, that were getting blocked. So you'll hear about Facebook being blocked in China, as though the real question is which American internet companies will get in or not, when in fact the story of the Chinese internet is also about multiple foreign influences. The influence of Singapore's techniques for managing the internet are important, and East Asian fashions and styles on the internet can be important as well. This is just a shot of an internet cafe. If you read an American story about internet cafes, it'll often be about whether people can access forbidden news sites there and things like that. But actually, what most people are doing most of the time are playing video games. This is QQ. So the story about Facebook being blocked often leaves out that there's something a lot like Facebook, China. But what's left out, and this I think might be something that will not surprise any of you, is that Facebook and QQ are not exactly the same. And so it's a variation on Facebook. And one of the things that's very different that surprises very much American audiences, when I tell them, when they say, so what is different about it? And I had to ask young people who'd moved between the two systems. They said, well, of course, one difference is on QQ, people put their blood type, which nobody ever does on Facebook. And this has nothing to do with American influences, but rather flows throughout East Asia of this idea of blood types being associated with personality types. What Americans think about as signs of the zodiac. They can say, okay, that makes sense. The fourth thing to remember about China, and this I think was the single most important overarching point I made in the first edition that still holds, in some sense, even more so for the second edition. And that's that the idea of modernization has undergone in the last 5 or 10 years in the discussion of China a radically large shift. And I'll explain what that is. In 1978, when Deng Xiaoping began, in 79, when Deng Xiaoping came into power, the big question on many people's minds was, can China modernize? And there was a lot of consensus among people who disagreed about many things about the importance of this question and about the desirability of China being able to become more modern and developed. So Deng Xiaoping wanted China to modernize and develop, and he thought he had a way for it to happen. He would emphasize the 4 modernizations. He would play down the Maoist idea that what mattered was ideological purity most. He would be more pragmatic and say what really mattered was that China modernized in the realms of agriculture, industry, science, and defense. And a lot of people in the West were rooting for him to do that. He became Times Man of the Year not just once, but twice. There was a lot of ideas that here was finally a Communist Party leader that we could work with, that wanted for China what we wanted for China. When Deng Xiaoping came to America, a famous American at a public ceremony said this to him: "Dear Mr. Vice Premier, it is with great joy that we welcome you to our country. It is with true love that we extend our very best wishes to you and your people on your new long march toward modernization in this century." Anybody want to guess what famous American said that? When I say this, when I give this talk in America, I get the answers like Nixon, Reagan, Ford, Carter, Kissinger. All good answers, but all wrong. It was John Denver, who was invited to play for Deng Xiaoping when he was in America. And I suffered for that fact. In the mid-1980s, when I went to China, some of the only Western music that anybody knew was, I would say I'm American. They say, "Oh, can you sing Country Road? Let's take me home." This was somebody else, different from John Denver and different from Deng Xiaoping, who was also rooting for China to modernize, but in a different way. He said this was a critic of Deng Xiaoping, who ended up being forced into exile, Wei Jingsheng, during the Democracy Wall movement. He said, China needs a 5th modernization, not just the 4 that you're talking about, but one more, democracy. But why did he say China needed democracy? In part because without democracy, the modernization drive and economic growth will confront insurmountable obstacles. So he also thought that economic growth was needed, but he thought Deng Xiaoping's recipe was wrong. The Westerners who were rooting for Deng Xiaoping to succeed with this modernization thought that once you had modernization and development, democracy would follow. So Wei Jingsheng was saying, if you don't democratize, you won't be able to have an economic boom. The West was saying, have the economic boom, because then you will definitely democratize. The riddle of China for the Western mind is that somehow China had the economic boom without first democratizing, and had the economic boom without then democratizing. This is the major kind of conundrum that I think distorts a lot of the discussion of the country. If you flash forward to the early 21st century, you now have, as you know, cities like Shanghai has many more skyscrapers than New York, and now its urban landscape is being used in futuristic films. When I was in Shanghai in the mid-1980s, Shanghai seemed like a city trapped in the past. It was a place you would go to shoot films set in the 1930s without having to build special sets. Now it's a place people go to film films set 30 years from now that you don't have to build special sets for. Nobody's arguing when will China have markers of advanced modernization, development. Instead, though, what people are beginning to have more and more protests are about the costs of modernization, or the frustration that a certain amount of modernization has come, but the benefits of it aren't being distributed equally, or it's not clear to people that their quality of life is actually getting better as the skyscrapers get higher and higher, as the department stores get stocked with more and more goods. This, I think, was true in 2010 when I was writing. There had started to be these protests over issues like environmental issues of anger at toxic chemical plants, concerns about the costs of modernization, people were saying, yes, China is modernizing, but we want more of a say in how it happens. But I think that's become even more true since 2010, when you have scenes like this. This was a particularly smoggy day in Beijing a couple of months ago. And what I like about this is it shows, I mean, this is this eerie skyscraper with a big video screen on that. It shows that it's not that the smog is, say, a sign of backwardness. It's a sign of a kind of development run amok. So at the same time you have this that seems to speak of a future, you now start wondering if it's the future that you really want that will be livable. The last of the 5 things that I think everybody needs to know about China, and I think this is important to tell people in China or in Hong Kong, as well as in the United States, that the US and China are often set up as kind of opposites and radically different structures. And in some ways, of course, they are. When Xi Jinping was chosen, he was chosen by a secretive meeting by a group of old men involved in a process that we really know very little about. And at the end, they said, this guy will now be in charge of an enormously large population. Well, I could have just been describing the Pope, how he's chosen. But that's actually how the Communist Party and the Vatican choose their leaders. But it's not how leaders are chosen in the United States. There was actually an election, rather than, as Richard McGregor of the Financial Times says, in America you have an election, in China you have a selection. Those are very different kinds of things. So in some ways, of course, the two countries are different. You can think of other ways. You can put it more negatively, that in China, when they want to decide on a budget, they just make the budget. In America, they often can't because the two sides refuse to do it. So you can think about efficiency, or you can think about democracy, and they're very different structures. But in many ways, I would argue, the United States and China are more similar than either would like to imagine, and that to much of the rest of the world, they also seem more similar to one another than either country would think. In many ways, China now is thought of in the rest of the world with a kind of trepidation and excitement about how fast it's changing that used to be felt about America, when America was the rapidly industrializing country that seemed to be moving faster, building higher, and shaking up the rules of the game in a way that nobody was quite sure how to make with it. In the United States, as one symbol of that, when we were the rising power that was known for its fast, big trains, its infrastructure projects, its skyscrapers, we hosted World's Fairs were one of the things we used to host that would show that you'd arrived as a major country. The first World's Fairs were all held in Europe, in capitals. Then the first place to get into the mix besides Europe was America. And when America hosted its first World's Fair, it didn't just host a World's Fair, it hosted the biggest World's Fair the world had ever seen, and then continued to try to top those mega events. China, in those days, hosting the World's Fair was as important as hosting the Olympics is now. China, when it hosted the Olympics, tried to not just say, we've gotten our chance to host the Olympics, but to blow all previous Olympics out of the water. And then when China hosted its first World's Fair in Shanghai, it hosted the biggest World's Fair in the history of the world. With these, this is a shot from, I didn't make it to the Olympics, I did make it to the Expo, for better or worse. The other things about China and the US that are more similar than different, both China and the United States were founded on revolutions that were anti-colonial revolutions or were about freeing their country from foreign control of one sort or another. And the American government or American patriotic stories, myths, are all about the fact that America hates the idea of colonialism of any sort. Yet a lot of the world looks at us and says, well, what you did by taking over Hawaii sure looks a little bit like colonialism. What you did by taking over parts of the country that used to be a part of Mexico, that would look like expanding your reach imperialism. China also says the one thing we really stand for is sovereignty over no country should interfere with any other place's sovereignty. But a lot of the world looks at Tibet and says that sure looks a little bit like expanding your reach, looks at other things. Both China and the United States are often seen as the countries that are most likely to veto things that the rest of the international community are in favor of, that seem to be ready to go their own way in different ways. There are other ways I think China and the US are similar. One way they aren't similar often is how they cover China. So I'll end with 5 quick notions of stories that are the ways in which the media in China and the US differ. Some things that Americans think of as big China stories aren't seen that way in China. People either don't care or can't talk about them or some combination of these things. I've already mentioned the 1989 Liu Si. So this is an episode of The Simpsons that deals with it as that. So you have images like this in the American press of the Nobel Prize and the line of tanks. Neither of these things, this was Liu Xiaobo, Nobel Peace Prize, neither of those were seen in the same way in China. Sometimes the US and the Chinese media both agree that a story is big, but handle it in nearly opposite ways. For example, Libya, when Muammar Gaddafi was being threatened and toppled, that was a big story in America, and it was a big story in China. I happened to go to China right as the event was breaking. And in America, the discussion was, when Gaddafi falls, will Libya democratize? In the Chinese press, the question was, when Gaddafi falls, will Libya become unstable? These are very different ways of thinking about and worrying about the same issue. Sometimes the story is handled in complementary ways in China and the US, but still with radically different little twists. And here, because I know one of the core courses is on sports, I have thrown in something on Linsanity, the Jeremy Lin phenomenon last year. That was a big, big story in China, in the US. It's a big, big story in China. Was it a big story in Hong Kong? Jeremy Lin? It was also a big story in Taiwan, which are all handled differently in each of those different places. In Taiwan, it was, yeah, Jeremy Lin, he's our boy. His parents came to the US from Taiwan. In the mainland, yes, Jeremy Lin, he's our boy. He's ethnically Chinese. In Asian American communities, yes, Jeremy Lin, this is finally an Asian American who's a big star. We show we can excel in sports. And that could be said if you were Filipino American or Japanese American. The other thing that was, and so, I went to China right as it was breaking, as it were big. He was on covers of magazines as he was in the US. But there were some things that were kind of different about the stories, and one of them was, another part of the story that played differently was the fact that he went to Harvard. Now that was mentioned in America, and what was interesting about that was he went to one of the major universities in America that's known to have pretty lousy sports teams, or doesn't usually have very good sports teams. In China, though, I think it was different. It was like he went to a really good university and he excelled at a sport. Because it's unusual that that happens in China. It's not unusual that that happens in America. It's just not that campus. Like somebody goes to UCLA and excels, that's like normal. I grew up a UCLA fan, so we always won. Yeah, anyway, basketball. So that was a slightly inflected different story. And also the fact that he went to Harvard meant something just quite specific because, Harvard, I got a master's from Harvard, and I know there are some people here who got degrees at Harvard. I don't want to diss Harvard, but this idea of it standing head and shoulders magically above all the other brands doesn't really how some Americans might, but in China, it has this special kind of mystique, as the Harvard Girl books were big hits, where they wouldn't quite be if they were Stanford. Jeremy Lin wanted to go to Stanford. They just didn't recruit him heavily. Anyway, I'm also a loyal Californian, so all right. the special thing about Harvard, even to the point where this is a part of a guidebook to Boston, when Americans go to Boston, Harvard is like not one of the top sites you go see. And I was thinking, this is like really weird, like Harvard, why, you go to Boston and you go to Harvard and MIT, and you're like tourist site. But again, it actually kind of fits with what I was saying about China and the US. China now is a little bit like what the US was when it was rising, because I think the rising China wants to, in a sense, accomplish some of the things that America did, right? So one of the things that's admired is this American campus that sort of symbolized, the top achievement in a certain realm. Well, when America was rising, we had that same kind of feeling, mystique about Oxford, Cambridge. And I realize now when Americans go to England, one place they kind of want to see is Oxford. And that was even before. Now younger Americans want to go there because that's where he filmed Harry Potter, but that's a different story. Sometimes a China story is seen the same way in the US and in China, but differently someplace else. All right. So when China issued a competitor to Google Maps or Google Earth, that was seen as a big story in China and the US, and it was partly China versus Google. When that, so that was a story that was like this competition, right? There had been tension with China and Google. But I happened to be in India when the story broke, and the Indian newspapers covered it differently, because what they fixated on wasn't the rivalry between Google, an American company, and China. They focused on the fact that in the Chinese version of the mapping, parts of India that China claims, there are these disputed places, showed up as part of China in the Chinese mapping program. And they focused on it as a political story rather than an economic one. Now, Google's no dummy, so they came out soon with a new version that allowed you, when you were in China, to see those places as part of China, and when you were in India, to see them as part of India. The last thing, some things seen as big China stories in China get little attention in America. They're things that we just don't know about, or just don't care about, or we just don't get. For example, I work on Shanghai, so the Shanghai Expo is a big deal for me. I'm interested in World's Fair, so the Shanghai Expo is a big deal to me. I would tell people I was going to be in China during the Expo, which was like a World's Fair. They said, do they still have those? And for 7 years, I'd been going to Shanghai, and it had been like promoted on all the posters. The Expo's coming, the Expo's coming. And when I was in China during the Expo, it was the big front page news story like every day. Well, when are we going to set the world's attendance record and beat Japan and things like that? And it was a big, big thing. And yet it didn't get any traction in America because it just didn't fit our sense of what the big stories of the day were. These are just some shots of it. Pavilion of the Future. Expos were always, World's Fairs are always about getting a sense of different parts of the world, an idea of what the future might be like. There's a reason why it would be exciting in, say, Shanghai. But I went to the Expo, and it was actually really boring for me. But I realized it wasn't meant for me. What World's Fairs are like, and this is a connection between America. World's Fairs, when America had its first World's Fairs, they were the biggest attended World's Fairs ever. They were held in places like Philadelphia and then Chicago. Most of the people coming there came from other parts of the Midwest. They were people who had never been to Europe or never been to other parts of the world. And by going there, they got like a sense of this world that they might someday go to, or they at least wanted to imagine. The people who poured into the Expo in Shanghai were people from the hinterlands or nearby provinces mostly, who had never been abroad but were starting to think that maybe someday they would be able to go abroad. And they went there in the same way to get this virtual sense of places they hadn't been but might want to go, or maybe couldn't go but would want to know something about. So when I went there, after, besides being let down by it just wasn't enough kind of fun and magic, I went to places that I've never been to and maybe can never go to. I hung out in the Axis of Evil section of the fair. Lebanon, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, places Americans can't go or don't go. All right, and this is, I like to end, I'm I like to end with this slide wherever I am. This is about the expo, and it partly just shows what a big deal the expo was. The big screens. This was taken a couple years before it, and they were. And here I want to say though, when I've given this kind of talk, I've shown this poster for a long time, just in part because it brings home some of the things that I brought up, just how modern Chinese cityscapes now look, and to Americanize, quite futuristic. Though less so if you're in Asia, where this is more similar to some other cityscapes. But lately, especially thinking about American fears and worries about China, and also this idea of America thinking that China is now doing what it did and doesn't know how to deal with it or what the future might hold, this picture actually starts to seem a little creepy. This giant baby coming at you off the screen. And I've made a lot of flip comments. Thank you for laughing. And I've talked a lot about popular culture, but I am a historian. I'm a scholar. We're at a major university, so there should be a little bit of academic gravitas at the end of the talk. So I will tell you that when I look at this, it brings to mind a line by Homer Simpson, who said, "Children are our future unless we stop them now." And this, I think, sums up some of the American attitude toward China, is that the idea of American ideas about China is, when are they going to grow up? When is this country going to shed the ways of the past and start really being more of a full-grown player on the international stage? We really want that to happen. We want China to be able to take care of itself. And now we're thinking, we're going to have to deal with not being the only big kid on the block. And how are we going to deal with the world? We kept wanting them to cut to this stage. And now that they are, we're uncomfortable about it. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jeff, for an excellent and very interesting presentation. We have roughly 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, so please take advantage of this opportunity. Please identify yourself, when you raise your question. Please raise your hand. Yes, this lady.
You mentioned that China is facing serious milk powder problems, and also you mentioned that China and America probably have more common than we admit. Actually, I just thought of a book I read several years ago. It was Sinclair's The Jungle. Do you remember that? Yeah. And it revealed some serious food safety problems in Chicago. And actually, the author suggested a very interesting solution. It's about communist way. But actually, it's not how Americans solve the food safety problem. So I wonder if you could summarize how Americans solve the food safety problem. And do you think China is equipped with these conditions? Thank you.
Oh, great question. Bringing up Sinclair, I think, is a really, it's a wonderful way of drawing out my point about the similarities of problems then and now. There are other examples, not just food safety. When Charles Dickens came to America, he complained about all the copies of his books that were being sold that he wasn't making any money on because they were pirated. America wasn't seen as playing by international copyright. So a lot of, this idea that American cities weren't safe, there was too much pollution, all of these things. I think that solving the food safety issue is partly structures like a Food and Drug Administration that investigates things and keeps an eye on them. I mean, I think that was part of actually Hugh Hua's point. That China has an elaborate film censorship mechanism if some of the energy that was put into that could be put into this. But I think, the issue that the Chinese government has right now with food safety and with smog levels and with other things is a sense of just not, it's a trust deficit, a lack of trust in official structures to do what they're supposed to be doing. So I think there are many things that would help. I think a freer press helps, actually. so that you can get a feeling that there are people investigating these things with a free hand when they happen. I think we've seen a series of public health crises with SARS. Part of the problem is just that people increasingly in China are not trusting what they're being told by the sources. So, America had a lot of these problems, and they haven't solved all of them, and there are still flaws in America. But there is, I think, a freer press to investigate these things, to get the news out quite quickly without a feeling that you might be punished for telling something that the government doesn't want you to tell. Also, a more independent judiciary that can actually punish people, that you feel that people who are responsible will actually get punished. I mean, food is one example, but I think this is relevant to a lot of other things. The United States has train crashes, and other places have train crashes, but the way in which news about the Wenzhou train crash in 2011 was hushed up, and efforts to kind of figure out what went wrong were literally kind of buried at first. And a feeling people had that sometimes people get punished when they're responsible for these mistakes, but sometimes if they have the right connections, they don't. It's all part of this set of interlocking things.
Okay.
Thanks for the question.
Well, actually, may I add a footnote to this? I think the Chinese government has studied the U.S. Food and Drug Administration extensively and wanted to copy from the U.S., but as you know, it didn't really work that out. Okay, there's a question from here.
Oh, yeah, does this work? Yeah, my name is Ralph Schroeder. I'm visiting from Oxford University, but I'm going to talk about
Home of Harry Potter, yeah. Hogwarts.
I'm from the other part.
Okay.
The real part. But I'm going to ask about the other place that you mentioned, Harvard, which is that, I don't know if you know the study by Gary King of the internet in China, where they did a huge analysis of blogs and other social media. And basically, if you don't know it, found that if you're an individual, you can criticize the government as much as you like, but if you engage in call for collective action, then you're censored. Now, I've come as a visitor here, and I was very impressed by that study, but what I've heard here is that that's not actually the case, that there's a lot more subtlety, and it's almost the opposite in terms of the kind of individual anecdotes that I hear here. Could you comment on that, please?
Sure. First of all, Hong Kong University has the analysts of the internet that are among the people I rely on most for my information. And I had the great pleasure this morning of having coffee with David Bandersky and of the China Media Project, which I think is an amazing enterprise. And I learned a lot simply, as I always do, from talking to him. I think there's a key point, and I mean that study you mentioned, I didn't associate it with the name, but I know what you mean now. It actually is a tremendously insightful thing in this sense. And it goes back to the Orwellian notion. In an Orwellian state, you're also worried about what you say in private, coming back to haunt you. You're worried about what gets said over the dinner table. This idea that, and in the worst moments of the Cultural Revolution, that was also something you had to worry about. If somebody inadvertently let slip something against the government, then you could suffer for it. Increasingly in China, when we just talk about speech, people don't worry about saying a political joke, who's going to listen, overhear them, and things like that. The government is very willing to allow people to engage in kind of idle complaining and see it in partly as a safety valve kind of thing. One of the most insightful things I've ever heard about China was from a bartender in 1996 on a river cruise when I'd come back after having last been there in 1988 and expected to find a more tightly controlled, chilled place, and yet people seem to be saying things. It used to be, even in the 80s, two Chinese, if they had just met, would spend a while feeling each other out, make sure they could try before they would say anything like a joke about politics. When I got there in 96, I introduced two people who immediately were like making jokes to each other. And I said, what's going on here? And he said, the watchword now in China is 没有运动什么都可以. If it's not a movement, anything goes. That's not true in Tibet. It's not true in Xinjiang. It's not true when it comes to some specific things, areas of taboo. But largely, the government's strategy is to care much more about anything that could lead to action than to simply idle expression. But the lines between those can get fuzzy in some interesting ways. I mean, even something that's seen as a kind of indirect call to action can lead to censorship. And also the individual within certain kinds of movements, there can be certain kinds of public movements that are allowed up to a certain point, but a person who's identified as an instigator then suffers greatly for it. So it's a hard way to track it. But I think the general point of that is, I think even if you think about Ai Weiwei was not just punished. He really started getting cracked down on, not so much just for saying outlandish things, but when he was using Twitter, he was inviting people to, he's going to be such and such a place. Those of you following me on Twitter, why don't you come? Which again, he wasn't saying, let's organize a movement to overthrow, but he was saying something that looked like it could potentially be like a movement. Falun Gong, the incredibly over-the-top crackdown on it, it wasn't about the ideology so much as the organizational side of it, the idea that here was something. But it's not even just organized or not that draws the harshness of the state. The state is particularly harsh on anything that seems to be drawing people together across class lines or across geographical lines. So petition drives on the internet, even if they're not calling for direct action, can lead to a harsh crackdown. So in that sense, Liu Xiaobo with Charter 08, it wasn't just him as an individual speaking out, it was that this was something that was trying to connect people across that. So if you think about it as like kinds of expression that could potentially connect people versus kinds of expression that are just a single individual mouthing off, I think it works fairly well.
Well, owing to the lack of time, I'm afraid that we can only take one more question. But for those of you who want to see Professor Wasserstrom, we have a small setting conversation tomorrow at 5:30, and we will announce it later. So students who want to meet him and discuss with him will have plenty of opportunity. So the last question from this gentleman.
I'm Luca. I'm a first-year BA student. I'm Faculty of Arts. I'm a Greek, Romanian, Italian, Chinese American by ethnicity. I'm from international school background. I wanted to ask, you talked very little about education. So what do you think is the significance and or issues or any thoughts in general of a common core curriculum in Chinese about China for all departments, for more or less all students eventually? What do you think are the implications of that? How does that relate to different kinds of students? Because there are students here from all over the world, and there are students from a variety of communities. So what are your thoughts on that? Well,
I'm not going to bite the hand that's feeding me here, that's brought me to this lovely campus. No, I think it behooves people. I think there are ways in which China is becoming so important globally that I think being ignorant of China or having a shallow understanding of China is problematic for people living anywhere in a certain way. I think so. There's no requirement for people to take anything about China in America, but I would like them to at least have a little bit of knowledge about it. So I think being physically located in Hong Kong, it makes enormous sense to have some understanding of what the, in some ways, country that you're part of is, when you're here, is what it means. And it also just is, if you think of Hong Kong as separate, it's important to have a notion of what that other place is. But I think I think one of the reasons why it's important is that there is so much partial knowledge, mythologization of China going on, that a critical perspective on China is truly important. Because I think we're in a kind of dangerous moment in some ways about understanding of China, because some of the most misleading things about China are simultaneously being said by the Western media and by the Chinese official state media. This notion of 5,000 years of unchanging civilization, or this notion of a kind of homogenized China that's one thing, is something that serves a kind of nationalistic purpose, the Chinese government, and is a tendency of outsiders to misunderstand about China, to think about, to overlook things like the incredible regional diversity within China, the incredible generational diversity within how different people's life experiences are, different generations. So I think having a critical perspective on China is really valuable.
And how do you think it's important for mainland Chinese people, because studying at Hong Kong U, because we have a large mainland Chinese population, do you think it's very important for mainland Chinese students to learn about mainland China in Hong Kong?
Oh, well, I think I think it's important. And I would say in a similar way, because I do think that I think there's much that's being taught about China within the mainland that is a misleading representation of it. I think, I don't want to exoticize that. I think most education, there are moments of a patriotic education that grossly simplifies the notion of whatever country you're in. In China, I think the limit on diverse ideas about certain core elements of recent Chinese history makes it particularly problematic. So I think this is a great value, in fact, that being able to be exposed to another set of stories about China is, I think, really crucial. I think to put it another way, I think it's at least as important for students from mainland China to take a core course here as it would be for students from any other part of the world here.
Do you think the implications for those students to go back?
Why don't you come tomorrow? Come tomorrow, and I'll enjoy talking about this more.
I think you should go tomorrow and be in the first row and continue this line of questions. I have to close it there because I'm very aware of time and people have got other commitments. So please come along tomorrow and ask some more questions. I got three things that I want to do just to round the evening off. First of all, I'd like to invite Professor Amy Choi, who is the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning, to present a little gift to Professor Wasserstrom in appreciation of his talk. And secondly, to remind you again of the conversation with Professor Wasserstrom tomorrow. It will take place in the Knowles Building, room 112, and it begins at 5:30. And lastly, could I also remind you of the final, or the fifth lecture in this series, which will take place on the 19th of March in this lecture theatre. And the speaker is Professor David Held, who is an internationally renowned scholar in the field of globalization. So I hope to see you all here again on the 19th. Thanks very much.